Hello. Last video in this series, looking at linked services and the Proxy API, we're going to basically consume our upstream external API now from a workflow. So it's a little bit more code heavy this because creating custom workflow steps is a little bit more complicated than simple widgets, but the mechanism that we're going to use in terms of calling that upstream API is exactly the same. We're just going to go via the proxy, and what we're going to do is we're going to create a workflow that we can trigger from a menu. That every time I trigger it is basically just going to run a workflow and add some transactions to our upstream service. If none of that makes any sense, you've probably not watched the other 5 videos, in which case I'd recommend you go back and watch the parts 1 to 5 before diving in this deep. Okay, so let's jump into Sherdo and just quickly recap where we got up to. So against our cases now, we have this custom widget. This custom widget basically uses the Proxy API to go and talk to an upstream service, both to add new transactions and also to list the ones that are already there, or at least list the last 5 transactions that we've added. We created a widget that would just go and call the Proxy API to call that external API to give us back this list that we just bind to the UI. If you remember as well, if we're going to admin, we have done this not by exposing any secrets or anything like that. We've done it via the Manage Linked Services tooling, and in here we've got this configurable custom service that we've created that's got all of the appropriate security information and our little rather noddy secret. Okay, so what we're going to do this time is we're going to integrate this into Visual Workflow, which is unlike the UI stuff that we did in part 5 that runs in the browser. Anything that happens in workflow is executed asynchronously in the background on the server, so we don't have quite the same problems, but we've still got similar ones in terms of like configuration and stuff like that. Okay, so as always when we're extending the system, we're going to start off in the developer IDE. And we're going to scaffold something new in here. We're going to scaffold a visual workflow action that has a designer. So we click that and we give it a name. We'll call it custom, no, let's do API demo workflow. So this is the widget that we created in API demo. API demo workflow is now our custom action. All this will be on GitHub. So we have this manifest now that is our custom step that will appear in the workflow designer. I'm not going to change any of this, so as with some of the other demo parts, it's going to look a little bit messy in the UI. Obviously you'd go through and name these properly, give them descriptions and all that kind of stuff. We're going to start, as always, on a workflow. If you've not built the custom workflow steps before, I would suggest you look at the developer overview video that's on help.sherdo.co.uk. There's a whole series there of about 6 hours worth of content that covers creating custom workflow steps from scratch in quite a bit of detail. So I'm assuming that you've already done these before, so I'm going to whittle through this pretty fast because there's quite a lot of code to go through. So for our workflow step, obviously we're going to be calling this upstream API, and that API expects an entity ID of some kind to be passed through to it to record a transaction against. It expects a folio to be sent up to it and a delta value as well, the amount in which to change the balance. So I need to reflect that in my factory class for the workflow action. The factory class represents the model for a workflow action as it is on the visual workflow canvas, without necessarily having any of the configuration UI or anything loaded or visible on the screen at the time. So with that in mind, we'll start off by taking this scaffolded stuff and we'll get rid of the configuration that it boilerplates for us, and we'll put our own stuff in there. So we're going to be capturing a work item ID, but we're not going to be capturing the ID directly. We're going to use a variable within the workflow process itself. This will allow us to trigger the workflow against any particular ID. That ID will be carried through into the context of that workflow execution, and we will use a variable to represent that we can then resolve at the point where the workflow runs. options, if that makes any sense. So the work item ID variable is going to default to null. It's going to have a folio, which will default to null, and it's going to have a delta amount, which will default to 0. So now we need to extend our actual model. So self.config.work item ID variable is going to be an observable property, and it's going to default to options config work item ID variable. So when we load it up, obviously it remembers how we've configured the step, and I've done that wrong. I need to put an equal sign there instead. Then we're going to have self.config folio. It's also going to be an observable bindable thing, and it's going to default to whatever we've currently got saved as the options config folio. Same with the next bit. Config amount is going to be an observable, and we're going to default that to options config amount. So it'll either use whatever these defaults are or whatever we pass in as part of the action options model, so the model that we've saved, in other words. Those are the only 3 properties I need to be able to configure it, but I don't want to add some validation as well, so I can't save my workflow unless I've completed all of the configuration for this action. So we'll extend the validation stuff to add the work item ID variable, and we'll say that that's a validator required work item ID variable. Specify the work item to record against. And then we want another one, which is the folio. We're going to make that required as well. So we go validator required. Scope is self. The observable is self config folio. We'll just say folio is required. And then the total validation error count that we've got from our step will be start at 0, and if we have a failure of work item ID variable, increment my fails, and if self-validation folio fails, then add 1 to my total fails, return my total fails. Okay, so that gives me my totals. I'll just get rid of all this stuff. What I do need to do though is, because I'm going to use a variable selector component for the UI to capture the work item ID variable, I need to start tracking that. I need to basically build a special kind of model that will be used by the variable selector component. So I need to track it, and I also then need to dispose of it at the end. So we'll say self UI extensions, the work item ID variable equals self track variable. So go start tracking this variable that's stored in self config work item ID variable, and I expect that to be of type identifier work type identifier. So whatever I want to put into that property will need to be a variable that's of the appropriate type, which will be a work type identifier. Well, obviously we're going to run this workflow against a work item, and the work item ID is going to get passed in. I think that's almost it. I just need to clean up. So in the dispose method, I need to get rid of that work item ID variable that we've created. I need to release all the subscriptions and memory and stuff that it's using. Right, so that's my factory method. So I can create my model, I can load my model. I've got everything that I need to be able to configure this, I think. Yes. Okay, so the next thing we'll look at is the server-side template. No, actually, we'll go to not the server-side code template, but the actual designer for the step. So the designer can be relatively straightforward. In terms of the back-end code, I just need to store a reference to the action and the model, so I don't need to make any changes there. The scaffolding stuff's fine, but I do need to dip into some of the elements in the designer designer HTML itself. So I'll keep this action configuration at the top. I'll change this widget section here to use a plus icon and with a title of record a transaction. Okay, I'm going to get rid of all of this. Okay, so the first thing that I want is I want to be able to select the variable that holds the work item ID. So I'm going to create a form group. I'm going to put a label in, and it's going to be against which work item. And in there, I'm then going to use a knockout component. I need to make sure that this component is referenced in my widget JSON, which it isn't. So I'll just paste in some of the common things we will use in there. Obviously you would normally be more picky about what you're putting in there. I think we're actually only going to be using the variable selector, but there we go. So I'll paste some stuff in that. Right, okay, so this is going to go against a particular work item. The component that I want to use is called core ff variable selector. I've got this binding wrong completely. I've missed a brace and the name. Right, so the name of the component is core ff variable selector, and the params that I want to pass to that is actions UI work item ID variable. So that is, if you remember when we created the factory method before, we created self UI work item ID variable, which tracked this particular variable, and that gives me a model that is compatible with the variable select component. So that's the name, the params. I need to finish off the component syntax. Like that. Then this is validated, so I'm going to put a div in here that's text danger, so it's highlighted in red. I'm going to make that visible if my action validation work item ID variable isn't set, and the text will be action validation work item ID variable. So basically, if that validator returns null, this won't be seen. If the validator returns an error message, it will show the error message and make this div visible. I'm bound to make a lot of mistakes along the way. There's a lot of inline code. Right, so I want another form group. This time I'm going to be capturing the folio. So we'll have a label called folio. Then we'll have an input. I'm not going to give it an ID. It's going to be a type of text. It's going to be a form control, just to make it look pretty. And I'm going to data bind that using the text input binding to action config folio, which is the thing that's in our factory method. Again, this is validated, so we'll go text danger. Data bind equals visible action validation, what did I call this, folio, yeah, and then the text will be action validation folio. So just as above, if the validator returns an error message, it's going to show it, otherwise the entire div is hidden. And then the last input that I want to configure is the amount. So I've got another form group, and we'll say amount. We'll do another input of type text. Or if you were doing this normally, you would probably make it either an input type of numeric and maybe use some of the decimal bindings or something like that. I'm going to keep it really simple. So if you were to type in, instead of a decimal value, you typed in hello, you're probably going to break your workflow. In this case, it's not defensive enough. The class is going to be a form control. And I'm going to data bind that to text import action config amount. I think that's it. What's that little red box moaning about? Oh, I'll put the type in twice, that's right. Okay, so I've got my designer, I've got my factory. What am I missing? I am missing my template. So the template is basically a super simple view engine template that will run, is passed all the configuration from your designer, and it's responsible for generating the server-side JavaScript code that will run for this step on the event engine. Okay, I'm going to get rid of all the boilerplate, which doesn't actually do anything, and all we actually want to do here is use the Proxy API to call the upstream external service API. So I'm going to create the request that the external service is expecting. So that's going to have a folio, with some text in it, and it's going to have the delta amount, which needs to be a value. Now, I've got my configuration model passed into this. So this, don't forget, is the code generation template. So in here, I've got access to change the code that's being generated based upon the configuration that's in my model. So I can go $.model to basically it'll do replacement of the values that are in my model, and my model contains configuration.folio. So that's going to create this. When it does the actual code generation, will get changed into var request folio whatever we've actually set in the configuration from the workflow step, and the delta is just going to be $model.configuration.amount. You would normally, again, if you were building this for real, you wouldn't just get the user to enter the folio and the delta amount in the visual designer. You would probably use variables so that they can set those by reading data from other sources, doing if conditions and all that kind of stuff. I'm just trying to keep it simple. We do use a variable for the work item ID though, so we're going to say let's let the work item ID equal null to start with. And then we need to inspect the actual work item variable. So we'll say let the work item variable is equal to whatever we set in the configuration model as the work item ID variable. And we're then going to expect that to be in the context of the event that's being processed, of the workflow event that's being processed. So we'll say, providing that's been set and we've got a work item variable, then let's read the work item ID from the context. So the context work item variable. So if my variable is called ShowDoID, it's going to look at context.ShowDoID, which we should have as part of the starting of the workflow, because we're going to create a workflow that's got a mandatory input variable. Right, I do want to add a little bit of safety there. I want to say if the work item ID is still null, so we've not actually been able to read it, then I'm going to log an error to the process execution log that says I don't have a work item ID, no work item ID. And I'm basically going to stop at that point. Failed to set a work item ID, cannot proceed. That'll do. I'm just going to make my life a little bit easier here, because I'm guaranteed to have got some of this wrong. So I'm going to say debug the request, and I'm going to do a log.information. And I'm going to go transaction is going against plus the work item ID, so I'll get that in my execution log, and I'll also debug what's in that payload. So I'll go text payload equals JSON stringify. Let's take the request object, no formatters, 4 characters. That should give me a JSON representation of the payload that I'm about to send. And then this is the important part. We're going to get a response by calling. Because the proxy is inside of Shodo, I can just use shodo.http post. So that's going to go and call a Shodo API from the backend event engine stuff that's running. And as we did with the UI, I'm going to be calling the proxy API. The proxy, the link service that I'm going to call, I gave the name of custom. So then delineate, and the URL that I want to call on the upstream service with this post is API transactions / and then the work item ID, so plus work item ID. And because it's a post, I want to send the body, and the body is the request that I've created up above it. So that's going to go away. It's going to go do all the token stuff. It's going to configure the URL that it actually needs to poke rather than just the URL fragment. It's going to go and call that API. It's going to do any security stuff that it needs to do. It's going to call the API, get the response, and send the response back in here. Now that's a post. It doesn't actually have anything in the response. So all I want to do is go if the response.status does not equal OK. Then I'll log a warning. And I'll say the response status was response status, so it's unauthorized or something like that. It should tell me quite clearly, and then I'll also throw at that point, because I'm going to deem that as a failure, not a success, a response. And by throwing that allows me to retry it. Otherwise, I'm just going to log information that the response was okay. Okay, so we've done the factory, we've done the template, we've got the workflow action, we've done the designer, HTML. In theory, we're ready to rock and roll and use this as a workflow step. So I'll just bust the cache because I've added some more manifests. As usual, you add a manifest, you've got to bust the cache. That'll cause the Shadow application to reload. And what I should be able to do is go into the workflow tools. So I'll go into Modeler. I should have perhaps done this in a separate tab because I'm guaranteed to have got some of this wrong. And we'll go into workflows and I'll create a new visual workflow. So it starts off with the boilerplate. In theory, I should have an uncategorized step in here, yeah, to do name API demo workflow. So that's the step we've just created in the IDE. So I'm going to drag that onto my canvas, and it's going to be the first thing I do. And I've definitely broken something because against work item it hasn't worked. Not sure what I've done there. Let's go get rid of that, and let's go and find out what I've done. Okay, so back in the IDE. Go to my step factory and I will start reading. Don't see anything wrong there. Might be helpful if I actually look if I've got any error messages. So let's open the console, create a visual workflow, drop my custom step in. Aha! Right, I see. Actions is not defined as because, right, okay, so that's in my designer template, is it? Action, actions. There we go. So against this component call def variable selector, I'm passing in parameters of actions. It's action. Extra S. Okay, let's go try that again then. So create visual workflow. Go to my toolbox, find my custom step, drag it in, move it to the top. Aha, it finally loads. Right, okay, so this is my configuration screen that we've just created for this custom workflow step. But I'm missing some stuff. I need an identifier, work type identifier. So I'm going to click add on that. So I'm going to give this a name of work item and an identifier of just ID. It's going to be a data type of work type identifier. That's what I'm expecting. It's going to be an input variable. So in other words, I'm going to pass this in to instances of this workflow when I start them, which means therefore it's mandatory. So I'm going to assign, I'm going to call the API, upstream API, with the work item ID that I've started this workflow against. My folio is just going to be hello there from workflow, and the amount, let's just make it simple and go, let's add 10. Just update this, give this the name of A1 test. So I've got my work item, input parameter, I've got my step, the properties of my step are correct, my plan will finish, so I'm just going to save and close that. Now, I need a way of triggering that workflow. I could do that in a whole bunch of different ways. I could use standard event triggers, so when a thing moves between states and all of that kind of stuff, that would all work. But for the purposes of the demo, what I'm going to do is just create another tab, go to one of my cases. I'm going to put a button on the main ribbon section up here. So there'll be a play button that says test. Click it, it's going to actually fire the workflow. So for that, I need to go into the menu editor for this work type, which you would normally get to by going through Modeler into work type editor. You'll end up selecting your work type and go to menu designer. I'm going to go to the additional top level buttons section. I'm going to override it and add a command. And the command I want to add is start a workflow. Choose that. The title on the menu will be test. And I'll give it an icon of FA play. Give it a play button. I need to select the workflow. A1 test is the one that we created. Now I'm getting my workflow input parameters. So the workflow parameter of work item ID, which is mandatory. And remember, that's the thing that's then going to get transformed to the current value and passed across to the API based upon the code template we created. I'm going to map that to the current work item ID. Add that, hit save, and I'm also going to show a completion message. So every time I click it, it'll give me a little toast that says done. Hit save, save the menu definition, and because I've changed menu definitions, I need to bust the cache. Okay, we're nearly there. We're nearly there. Let's go reload our portal. Okay, so here's my widget listing stuff that's coming back from the API with using the proxy from the UI. I've got my new test button on the ribbon. If I click that, I should get a done message, and theoretically, if I click refresh, we'll find it doesn't work. Great. It's all good, it's all learning, and it's all about showing you how to debug this stuff. So if I go into view processes, I should be able to find out what's gone wrong. So this is the process that it's just started, and it's in a state of error. I can open that up, and I can look at the main entry point, and hopefully, because I kind of preempted this, I've got some log messages that tell me what's gone wrong. Aha, okay, yeah, so it's gone. Transaction is going to be against this ID, which is correct. That's the ID of the work item that I'm currently looking for. But look at this, I've gone json.string50. That's not going to work. That's not correct syntax, I don't think. Okay, so what I can do there is going to go back into the IDE, and I can look at my template. And it was actually the logging that I added in the hopes of debugging stuff that I got wrong. So that actually needs to be stringify. Stringify, that looks correct now. So I'm going to save that. Now, because I've just made a mistake in a workflow step and the code generation has already run, I need to go and resave my visual workflow to regenerate the code for that plan. Right, so I've done that. So now, theoretically, I could just click the retry button here and it will go through or get to the next error, whatever. What I'm actually going to do then, I'm just going to trigger it from the menu again. In fact, I was going to delete that process, but I'll leave it running. So we know that that one's errored. Hopefully we'll get another one now. So I hit the test button. That's now triggered my workflow, and it's already gone to the completed phase, and I can see in my log that it logged a transaction against this with hello there from workflow, and theoretically let's just run this one as well, allow this to complete. So I'll retry it. That should run to completion then. There it is, it's done. So that's now working as well. So I should now have 2 new transactions in my upstream service. Hello there from workflow, £10 each. And I've gone up by £10, and just to prove that's working, I'll add another couple of those. And then I'll run the workflow to 3 times and refresh. 3 new workflow ones have gone in as well. Okay, that was quite a lot in a relatively short space of time. We basically decided that we were going to use the proxy that we had, the link service that we'd already defined for our upstream test mock transactional system. We already had the link service registered from the previous video. We just consumed it from a custom workflow step that we added to a visual workflow where we were able to specify which work item we wanted to record a transaction against. It let us enter the folio and amount, and using the standard workflow stuff, it did some code generation that would use the proxy API to call that upstream service and pass all the stuff around, and we saw it working, and we saw it sending the data up and the new data arriving back in the custom widget that we did in part 5. That is literally everything. We've now covered everything to do with linking your own custom services and the proxy API, so I hope it was useful. Thanks very much.